So, official welcome everybody. Thank you for waiting a bit. It's the British Institute at Ankara. I'm Leonidas Karakatsanis, I'm the Assistant Director of the Institute, and it's a big pleasure to welcome Dr. Emre Erol for this talk. Dr. Emre Erol is an Assistant Professor at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Sabancì University. He completed his PhD at Leiden University School of Middle Eastern Studies, where he also worked between 2009 and 2016. He holds an MA in History and a BA in Political Science from Sabancı University. And his book, titled The Ottoman Crisis in Western Anatolia, Turkey's Belle Epoque and the Transition to a Modern Nation State, was published by the editores in 2016, which is also the reason why Emre is here with us today, because this forms a part of a series of lectures that we host at the Institute this winter and spring term, which is a series in Ottoman and early Republican history. This is the first of those. The second will be in April 4th by Martina Becker, to the title Pragmatism, the Ottoman New School, and What Art Has to Do with It. And then on the 18th of April, we will have Banu Turnaoğlu with us, speaking about her book, The Formation of Turkish Republicanism. The main concept of the lecture series is work of young academics that has to do something with the UK. It can be a book published by a UK publisher. It can be a new post in the UK like Banu's, or it can be a work that has been facilitated through the Institute like Martina's.
I thought my work was interesting and that's why I was
Of course, everything has to be in to become part of the series. And I'm also very happy to welcome Dr. Oktay Özel. We had the chance to collaborate at other instances, workshops and conferences. And it's nice to have this kind of well-built links within Ankara's academia. And Dr. Oktay Özel is Assistant Professor at Bilkent University. He received his PhD from the University of Manchester in UK in 1993. And before joining Bilkent, he worked as an Assistant Professor at Hacettepe University. His research area is Ottoman social and economic history, with particular emphasis on historical geography, demographic changes, and migration. A lot of stuff that also Emre is dealing about and we will talk about today. His most recent book, The Collapse of Rural Order in Ottoman Anatolia, was published from Brill Publishing in 2016, while other published works include Dün Sancısı from Tariq Vakfı in 2012 and Türkiye 1643, Goşan'ın Gözleri from İletişim 2013. The format of the lecture is Emre will talk for about 50 minutes to an hour, then we will have a comment by Oktay Hoca, and then we will open the floor to discussion, and then there is a small reception. So we can keep discussing about
Thank you very much, Leo, for this very nice introduction, and thank you all for coming to this talk this evening. I will today be talking about a topic which I titled as Greeks and Turks at the End of the Ottoman Empire. What does microhistory tell us? And the title requires a bit of an explanation. I know that among you there are also members of the academia who are well versed in these topics and who are very knowledgeable about the empire and the transition to nation state. But perhaps I should also think about people who are not very familiar with the topic, so I want to say a few words about the choice of words in the title. First of all, actually the title is a little bit misleading because it says Greeks and Turks, two terminologies which are very meaningful today, but they are kind of retrospectively applied to a time period in which they did not mean the exact same thing they mean today. Because what I'm gonna actually talk about are mostly Ottoman Greeks, Rum, or the subjects of the then citizens of the Ottoman Empire, and Muslims in a way. Of course I'll be talking about ethnicity, thus Turks and Greeks are not totally irrelevant, but as one delves into the realities of the late 19th century, one often sees that in the official documentation, in oral historical archives, the accurate way to talk about these people would be Ottoman Greeks and Ottoman Muslims. The second part of the title says, what does microhistory tell us? And to explain that, I had this photograph at the background from the family archive of an Izmir Levantine family, Gufrey family. This photograph was taken in Samathos Hotel in the Izmir or Smyrna Quay area. As you know, one of the most lively parts of the then expanding town. And it actually depicts a moment of quarrel, a debate between port workers. The explanation of the photograph in the archive says this is probably a quarrel between different members of the Izmir community. They have a disagreement about who is to take the job or something like that. What does microhistory tell us is relevant with this photograph, because we more or less probably have a broad understanding of what happened in the larger transition from Ottoman Empire to successor nation states such as Republic of Turkey, Kingdom of Greece, and so on and so forth. And that macro picture is a picture of turmoil, is a picture of war, is a picture of displacement, is a picture of nation states emerging. So most of the time it underlines quarrel, it underlines competition, it underlines violence. I'm not arguing that violence, competition, or quarrel wasn't there. On the contrary, I'll be talking a lot about that. But what I will try to tell you today is that, does that big story of transition help us understand the smaller stories of transition when we look at provinces, when we look at towns, when we look at different parts of a very large geographical entity? Does it help us? And my argument will be yes and no at the same time. And I will try to argue that actually it would be much cleverer if we have nuanced and critical narratives about particular regions or groups of regions when we want to understand the transition from Ottoman Empire to post-Ottoman states or post-Ottoman reality, if you will. And in order to do that, today I will focus on a particular county in Western Anatolia. So without further ado, let's go into detail. Sometimes, again, among my audience, I have members who are not immediately familiar with the late Ottoman history. So this slide is kind of a warming up slide for the background and the context of the period that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the period of 19th century and early 20th century. And when we think about the Ottoman Empire at the dawn of the 20th century, if you will, early 900s, late 800s, what we have is still a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-linguistic society, and as such, actually it's a typical land-based empire. Of course, one can think about exceptional ways when one thinks about the Ottomans, but in terms of its diversity, it wasn't actually that different from Russian Empire or Austria-Hungary or Mughal Empire in India in terms of its diversity. This also has to be underlined for another reason. Today's post-Ottoman states are mostly homogeneous entities. Think about Republic of Turkey, for instance. More than 90-something% of the population are considered to be ethnically Turks and Sunni Muslims. Of course, this can be debated for various reasons, but you get the big picture. However, when we think about the late Ottoman Empire, even for that simple statistics, there's a big difference. It's assumed because that censuses are not very reliable, but it's assumed that somewhere between 20 to 25% of the entire Ottoman population around the turn of the century, 900s, was non-Muslims. In other words, this was an empire which had housed multiple ethnicities and religious identities. Another thing perhaps one has to underline is how one person can have multiple identities at the same time in the Ottoman context. For instance, when we think about Greeks, let's say, you might be inclined to label them as Orthodox Christians and Rum. But for instance, a recent publication from Cemal Kafadar talking about how the Rum identity was used demonstrates very interestingly that up until the late 18th century, actually even Muslims themselves sometimes refer to themselves as Rum. And Rum was not only a label that was used bureaucratically for ethnic Greeks, it was also used for other members of the Orthodox Christian community, including but not limited to Albanians, Bulgarians, Vlachs, and so on and so forth. In other words, these labels of ethnicity, religion, and language can overlap. And when we come to Western Anatolia, the specific focus of my story today, this overlap becomes actually more visible. Another thing to talk about the late Ottoman Empire at the dawn of the 20th century. Ottoman Empire is under almost constant external and internal pressures. This is not an exclusive list of external internal pressures. These are just some basic keywords. Nationalisms could be considered as both an external and internal pressure, for instance. Why external? Think about the newly emerging nation states in the Balkans, most of which are irredentist. In other words, they want to expand at the expense of the Ottoman territories. Think about, for instance, nationalist ideology finding its way among the middle classes of Muslims and non-Muslims alike in cosmopolitan environments of the Middle East, in Beirut, in Thessaloniki, in Izmir, Smyrna, or in Istanbul, Constantinople. All of that would be examples of internal pressures. Modernity can perhaps be, again, defined as both an internal and external pressure. As you know, Ottomans tried to reform their state and society, more so after the Tanzimat, but as early as Selim III onwards. And that in itself can be understood as a pressure, because think about the reign of a sultan such as Mahmud II. Basically, to put it in a nutshell, he tries to centralize the state, he does many reforms, he undertakes many measures, but in the end he ends up creating a lot of centrifugal outcomes. In other words, he ends up creating things that are not really centralist in essence. So that itself is a challenge too, and when you focus into everyday lives of people in provinces, in counties, you really see reflections of those major global trends. Capitalism, again, is a source of pressure. As you know, in the literature, Ottoman Empire is argued to have incorporated, connected with the world markets as early as late 17th and most likely during the 18th century. And any society which experiences a transition from an early modern or pre-modern economy into a modern capitalist one experiences a lot of changes. It experiences changes in the roles of men and women, how people situate themselves with relation to state, how people situate themselves with their own labor, with their product, how they sell it, and so on and so forth. If there's one place in the empire that such an influence is most visible, it is for sure places which do a lot of trade, which do a lot of production. And again, my focus today, Western Anatolia, thus is a very good reference point to see influences like that. Imperialism is naturally an external influence. Ottomans were arguably always competing with neighboring imperial entities. Russians, for instance, Austria-Hungary, for instance. But in the late 19th and 20th century, there's a new dimension to imperial competition. There is what scholars often refer to as the Great Divergence. In other words, different developmental trajectories between Western European states and the rest of the world opens the difference of strength in terms of state capacity so much that imperialisms of the 19th and 20th century can be very, very influential over especially states which are still in the process of transformation, such as the Ottoman Empire. So that's an emphasis, huh? This is a period of external and internal pressures. Another important theme that will be in the background of the story that I'm talking about, Ottoman Empire was a Wast geography. It was a Wast geography even after many losses against Russian expansionism during the 18th and 19th centuries. And this is important because sometimes we tend to think about the Ottoman Empire as one unified unit of analysis. Whereas when you are careful, you see that how states can operate throughout this vast geography is not equal across all geographies. How capitalism affects one part of the empire can be radically different than another part. How one provincial governor can exist without legitimacy from the center can be vastly different in different parts of the empire. In other words, different parts of the empire experiences the process of transformation, whether it's a transformation from pre-modern to modern, pre-capitalist to capitalist, or pre-nationalist to a nationalist reality. They experience it differently. I'm not going to get into too much detail, maybe we can do it in the Q&A, but one of the backbones of my study was adopted from a recent study from Cem Emrence, Remapping the Ottoman Middle East, in which he actually talks about Ottoman Empire as kind of a three distinct zones, in which there's a coastal area, there's an interior area, and there's a frontier area. And for each area, he defines a certain geographical location, and he says, for each area, when you're looking at modern reforms, capitalism, or identity politics, you have to employ a different theoretical framework. I will argue today that what Emrence defines as the coast, or the parts of the empire that experienced the modern reforms very early on, that experienced the effects of capitalism very early on, that was urbanized and modernized very early on, these areas are different than the rest, such as the interior and the frontier. And the best place to see that are actually port cities and port towns of the Eastern Mediterranean. Beirut can be an example, Alexandria can be an example, Haifa, Jaffa can be examples, but my examples today will be about the most connected parts of the empire in terms of economy, Western Anatolia. So, this then is a story of transformation and crisis. Sorry, crises, in plural actually. So the presentation will first talk about a period of transformation, and we'll try to interpret that transformation. And then it will talk about a very short but radical period of multiple crises. And then it will try to make an argument about what local history tells us. Western Anatolia experienced major transformations, especially after 1820s. Both the impact of central states' modernist reforms and the impact of a capitalist economy are most visible, especially after 1820s. When you look at a place like Izmir/Smyrna or Ayvalık, what you see are two major forces that are usually behind all those small changes from the level of everyday life to level of higher politics. And these two major forces can be identified as state and market, to put it in a nutshell. When we talk about state, of course, what we mean is Ottoman reforms. When we talk about market, what we mean is global capitalism. So when I'm looking at transformation in my story, I will be talking about effects of state and market. When one wants to look at the effects of state and market, port cities and port towns are perfect examples, perfect reference histories to talk about that. Consequently, today's presentation, which is based on my doctoral studies, actually a reflection of a microhistory, the microhistory of an Ottoman county, the county of Foçateyn. Teyn, as you know, coming from the Persian, double, two cities of Foça. The county of Foçateyn means Eski Foça or Palya Foça or Yeni Foça, Neo Foça. Today's presentation will focus on how all of this macro level narrative affected these two principal port towns and the county. What you see here is a photograph taken in 1913 from Eski Foça, from Palya Foça. It's a partial photograph that shows us a growing town from a medieval core to a modern extended neighborhoods around the sea, actually. For those of you who are not immediately familiar with the Ottoman geography or Western Anatolia or Foça, let me try to situate things visually in your mind. On the left-hand side, what we have is a zoom into Western Anatolia. Number 3 is a well-known reference point, the old city center of Izmir/Smyrna. Number 1 and number 2 are respectively Eski Foça, Palya Foça, and Yeni Foça, Neo Foça. Number 4 will be important in the story soon enough. Salt pans or memlaha or çamaltı salt pans. Basically the principal economic area of the county of Foçateyn, which is ironically outside the borders of the county of Foçateyn. And number 5 is not relevant for today's story. It is about the story on World War I. On the right-hand side, upside, what you see is a map of the Ottoman territories in the western part of the empire after the Ottoman-Russian War of 1877-78, what we know in Turkish as the 93 Harbi. It will be relevant for our story. Although I will be talking about Western Anatolia, soon enough you will see that I will be making an argument which is basically saying that what was happening in the Balkans will have a huge impact on Western Anatolia. So that's why it's important to situate where Izmir and Foça are and where the last remaining Ottoman territories were after the Treaty of Berlin. This photograph is from a port city, Izmir again, showing us how busy and lively the port city environment was. All right, just another zoom out to put things in perspective. The arrow points out to the location of the county of Foçateyn, northwest of Izmir. And again, you can see the territories that were left for the Ottomans to govern after the Treaty of Berlin and the rest of Anatolia. All right, so transformation and crisis. I promised you a story about transformation and then crisis. Let's start with transformation. Part 1. I told you there are two big forces, market and state. Let's look at market. When we look at the consequences of incorporation with global capitalism, and when we ask ourselves, what were those consequences for the history of a small port town like Foça, Eski Foça for instance, this is the list that we come up with. Incorporation into global capitalism meant, first and foremost, economic growth. Now let me try to explain this very quickly. I do this in 20 pages in the book, so I'll try to do this in a couple of sentences. Ottoman port towns were usually agrarian hubs whose primary purpose was to supply the necessary goods for the capital. And this was more or less an unchallenged economic role for them until the early modern era. What we see is, with the coming of an external market penetrating into the Ottoman market, demanding the goods for the external market, this role of an agrarian hub starts to change. In other words, instead of selling for the domestic markets, port cities and port towns can now sell to the international markets as well. That starts to change things. Concrete example. County of Foçateyn was famous for salt production, through those salt pans that you saw on the map. But they were usually limited and regulated by the central state, depending on its needs. In the 19th century, though, there's an enormous growth of salt business, and believe it or not, salt produced in county of Foçateyn was sold to the distances as far as Sri Lanka. In other words, the production expanded so much, and there was so much international demand for it, it created a larger economy. Well, we know the rest of the story. It's the same in 2018 as it was more than 100 years ago. If economy grows, it creates a pull factor. If there are not enough, usually bachelor males available to work as free labor, it attracts migration. That's precisely what happened in places like Foçateyn as well. When the economy grew, majority of the Muslim majority living in the county of Foçateyn, they were already small landholding peasants. In other words, they had their own land, they were tenants of the land in a way, and they did not need to sell their labor in the free market. But who else can sell their labor in the free market? Most of the Ottoman Orthodox Christians, which were ravaged by typical unemployment in the Mediterranean islands, including the Aegean Islands, of course, as Braudel shows us, were up for the grabs for jobs like this. So what really happened is throughout the 19th century, Ottoman Christians, especially from the islands in the Aegean, but also from the internal provinces of Anatolia, start to migrate to Western Anatolia, to places like Eski Foça. They migrated so much so, the demographic outlook of the towns changed from predominantly Muslim to predominantly Ottoman Christian. So demographic alteration, basically, was caused by integration with global capitalism. Now this is important. Why? This is happening in the middle of the 19th century. This is 1850s, 1860s. The peak days are 1890s. When nationalism, creation of nation states will take the central stage at the dawn of the 20th century, nationalist leaders will look back in time and they'll look back at this demographic alteration and they're going to interpret it not as an economic phenomenon, but as an ideological phenomenon, which is very important to remember later on. What else happened? Penetration into a closed economy, a story that you probably know if you're familiar with the Ottoman Empire. Gradually, incorporation into global capitalism means loss of control over state revenues, partial loss of control in some sectors, full loss of control in others. However, it might be negative for state in some instances, but it's not necessarily negative for, let's say, entrepreneurs, middle classes, or not even all people who are selling their labor in the job market. In the Ottoman case, global capitalism meant the emergence of intermediaries who know the Ottoman economy and who also know the European economy. These intermediaries, in the case of Western Anatolia, usually were coming from Orthodox Christian backgrounds, but not all of them were Orthodox Christians. That's also something that is important to underline. 18th century, but especially the dawn of the 20th century, we witnessed the emergence of a non-Muslim middle class. The emergence of this non-Muslim middle class relies on their knowledge of the internal networks of trade in the Ottoman Empire and their knowledge of the external trade networks outside the empire. So this situated them in a very peculiar situation. On the one hand, they were dependent on the existence of external demand and economic networks. On the other hand, they also depended on existence of an Ottoman framework, an imperial framework, which sustained with them, allowed them the legitimacy and the know-how of the internal markets. There's also another thing that I would like to underline. Usually when we think about the Ottoman non-Muslims, we tend to think about them as all middle-class members and all very rich and good to do with trade in the 19th century. Well, that's not the case actually. When you look at the big picture, most of the Orthodox Christians were still subsistence peasants. But some of them really got very rich with their good connections. So that's an important difference. Another thing that we usually make mistakes about is the role of non-Muslims in trade in general. When you look at the Ottoman Empire, what you see is in the internal trade, which was very voluminous, because remember this is still a big empire, actually Muslims dominated it. But when you look at especially certain sectors of international trade, salt trade will be an example for instance, you see dominance of non-Muslim Ottoman Orthodox Christians. The result, then, is a very interesting thing. I call it in my book, and I try to substantiate it in depth, I call it the emergence of a relative political and economic autonomy in Western Anatolia, where provincial elites, middle classes, still depend on an Ottoman framework, they want it, they need it, but on the other hand, they can kind of play against the state and its authority by using their specific position in society as new entrepreneurs, new middle classes which have good connections with the world trade. And that gives them some sort of an autonomy in which they try to define what it means to be a member of the Izmir upper middle class or middle class, what it means to live in a city, etc. And also it means major demographic change, which I tried to summarize in the first part. The photograph that you see here is a testament to this rather simplified version of a complex story. This is a contemporary picture that I took myself in 2012 from Eski Foça, Palya Foça, showing us neoclassical houses on the shore, which are actually all, without any exception, remnants of the era of economic growth. They were all built between 1817 and 1909-1912, immediately before the Balkan Wars. They are today in Turkish called yalı and comes from the Greek word yalos, as you know, on the shore, by the shore. Houses built were actually projections of middle class power and prestige, because most of them were actually summer houses purchased by well-off merchants in Izmir, the closest port city. So this is transformation part 1, and this is transformation part 2. We looked at the market, let's say. Now let's look at how state affected transformation. One of the best ways to do it is to look at the outcomes of the Ottoman reform movement. And again, ask ourselves the question, how did it affect places like Eski Foça? Ottoman rulers recognized the troubles of the empire at the face of external and internal challenges. Very simple summary. Ottomans, since the Selim III at least, know that something or some things have to be changed in the empire, and they are heavily investing in that. A series of reforms are introduced towards the end of the 18th century, which are particularly relevant for places like Eski Foça. These reforms include, for instance, introduction of, in the late 18th and early 19th century, registers that are concerned about censuses, income, location of the provincial roads, and so on and so forth. For instance, temettüat registers, income registers can be a perfect example. Provincial almanacs can be a perfect example. And the bottom line of all of these things are very simple. Knowledge is power. If you want to extract better taxes, if you want to extract better human capital when you need them for conscription in an army or when you need them for production, you need to know what is where. And for that, you need to produce modern knowledge about your people, your resources. So what we see is Ottomans start to create this framework in which there's more knowledge. It is easier to understand what is where, but consequently that also makes it easier for entrepreneurs to understand what is where. It makes it easier for Europeans and the merchant intermediaries in the Ottoman Empire to make use of this knowledge, especially for trade. The aim of the reforms are usually empowering the state and increasing its capabilities. Those aims are achieved to some extent, but there are also very interesting results. For instance, following Mahmud II's reign, especially in the era of Tanzimat, as Ottomans introduced modern legal norms or codes or practices, they facilitate capitalist development. They make it easier and more manageable to take credits, to, for instance, pursue economic interests by way of investing in this or that places. In other words, they create a legal framework in which it is easier to invest, buy, and sell. As they invest in reform, as you know, reform is expensive, especially if you're aiming military reform, Ottomans become heavy spenders. If you're interested in economic history, you know this very well. The Khidr family in Egypt experienced the same problem. Indian rulers of the Mughal Empire experienced the same problem. Japanese, Chinese, Koreans all experienced the same problem. If you want to reform, you need cash money, you need liquidity. That is usually lacking in your yet pre-modern ways of collecting money and tax, so you are heavily indebted to external economies. Ottomans happen to have the same outcome, and as you know, at one point, they first de facto and then de jure go bankrupt, and an external body is formed to be able to collect the debts of the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Public Debt Administration. That is also important in places like Foça. This photograph is not from Foça, it's from Izmir. I worked so hard to find an equivalent of that in Foça, but I was not lucky. Actually, it was during and after the establishment of Oktay, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, that major investments in building of quays, ports, docks, and depots were undertaken in the Ottoman Empire, in places like Eski Foça. And you can see in the statistics very clearly, once they were built, depots, better docking stations, and so on, the volume of salt trade, for instance, in Foça is again exploding enormously. So it again attracts more people, it attracts more jobs, and so on and so forth. And all of that is ironically linked to the story of reform, because central state is trying to make things better for itself, but again it's creating centrifugal economic outcomes. Another interesting thing, which is again related to places like this Izmir quay, is the emergence of places, public spaces, which then increase intercommunal and intergender interaction. What do I mean by that? Modern parks, modern sports clubs, quays, building of roads and infrastructure usually crash through traditionally separated neighborhoods. For instance, in the case of Eski Foça again, Palya Foça, the medieval town center was usually broadly separated between the Muslim and non-Muslim quarters. There was a very small number of neighborhoods that were mixed. But after the building of quay and the expansion of new neighborhoods, these neighborhoods started to mix as well. And interestingly, around the second half of the 19th century, in what is left to us in the form of oral historical documentation, we started to see Ottoman Muslims and Ottoman Christians, in this case Orthodox Christians, talking about an Ottoman identity, playing with the kids of the neighborhood which were previously not accessible to them, and this interesting interaction taking place. In Foça, I was able to see signs of that. So this is the story of transformation again simplified and very broadly. As you know, both the effects of reform and the effects of global capitalism come to a halt and enter to a new level with the coming of the Balkan Wars. How did things look before what I will in a second describe the era of crisis in Western Anatolia? Let's look at the case of Eski Foça, Palya Foça. Demography is radically altered from dominantly Muslim Ottoman to dominantly non-Muslim Ottoman. This photograph you see over here is taken in 1913. This peninsula that you see over here is the medieval town center. On the right-hand side, what you see was then called Mikrosyalos, which is literally translated into Turkish as Küçük Deniz. And the other one expanding towards the other end of the peninsula is called Megalosyalos, also literally translated as Büyük Deniz. And these two neighborhoods all emerged without exception in the era of transformation and expansion. This one was almost exclusively Orthodox Christian, however it had a mixed quarter towards the end close to the peninsula. The other one was again almost predominantly Muslim, but had a larger mixed quarter again towards the connection with the peninsula. State reforms facilitated trade and growth. The two large buildings that you see over there in the picture used to be salt depots. First one was constructed by the Ottoman states. There were 4 in total. The 3 others were constructed again by the Ottoman states, but this time with the instructions of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. All of them contributed to an enormous rise in the volume of salt trade, for instance. It is not possible to zoom from this distance, but there were additional churches, mosques, and schools that were built all in the 19th century. Again, mixed gender public spaces emerge and intercommunal interaction increases. The example of that in Foça, again not visible from this side of the picture, but on the other side of the peninsula there's the first quay that was built so large ships can dock without using smaller boats for the transformation of the load. Interestingly, in memoirs, that area is described as the first place where people start to walk at night and encounter their neighbors from different neighborhoods and so on and so forth. So in the year of 1914, right before the Great War, or right before what I'm in a second going to call the spring of organized chaos, it looked like a cosmopolitan and economically connected space. This is something I worked very hard during my research. I always asked myself, were there any signs of sustained inter-ethnic or intercommunal conflict until 1914? It can be of economic reasons, ideological reasons, religious reasons, so on and so on. And my conclusion is there were no signs of inter-ethnic or intercommunal conflict until 1914. The largest cases of violence for over a century in this period when this big transformation is happening are cases about piracy. Pirates trying to loot actually ships or the town at different occasions throughout the century. My book's title is a belle epoque. Obviously, it was promoted by my publisher as a sexy title. In my own work, I always used in quotation marks. It's not a terminology that I choose to use. Actually, interestingly, almost all of the accounts, especially that belong to the Orthodox Christians that were forced to live this place, as you're going to see in a second, used to remember these days as a belle epoque. That's their terminology. So in a sense, this belle epoque in the memoirs is a period of increasing encounters among communities and the fragile cosmopolitanism, experimentation with ideas of what it means to be Ottoman, are visible, are there, but they are not very strong. Also in the background are the first examples of nationalist ideas, which I talk about in the book. 2 examples that I can give you are 2 separate cases of communal expression of national identity, one from the Orthodox Christian community and one from the Muslim community, one about a school, one about a national ceremony during the opening of a newly built house. So this is how things looked like before the era of crisis in Western Anatolia. And this is the larger version of that photograph. I forgot that I had that in my presentation. Is it visible here? No. Let me see. Anyway, yeah, this is a larger version then. All right, the period of crises starts. I use a framework in my book, and it's open for debate if you like it or not. From my point of view, there's almost constant warfare between years 1911 and 1922 in the Ottoman Empire. Not in the same places, not in the same geographies. And there are periods of quote-unquote peace, but I would call it peace on paper. And in most of the time, if there's not a war, there's probably a violent intercommunal event going on. This period actually starts with the Tripolitanian War in 1911 between the Ottomans and Italians. And without that war officially ending, actually the Balkan Wars start between 1912 and 13. And Balkan Wars actually brings violence to Western Anatolia. When I say the war brings violence in Anatolia, wars don't have their own lives. Of course, these are elites and decision makers which actually take policies which cause the violence to spread to Western Anatolia. When we look at the relationship between Ottoman Muslims and non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire as a large, right before this period of crisis, of course we are not talking about the cosmopolitan habit. We're talking about an environment which different formulas of coexistence and competition were formulated at the same time. But what we see here is, after 1911, but especially after the Balkan Wars, there is an enormous spike, there's an enormous negative spike, if you will, between the relationship of Ottoman Muslims and non-Muslims. It deteriorates, basically. And actually, there's another very important event happening during the Balkan Wars, actually right between the first and the second one, a coup. And this coup, although does not necessarily relate to our microhistory, as you'll see in a second, will be very, very significant for our microhistory. February 1913, as you know, the Unionists, the members of the Committee of Union and Progress, who had been struggling to consolidate power since 1908, who never really able to do that, get close at some moments but then lose it, attempt to seize power with a successful coup d'etat, and they install a dictatorial regime. And by the time, they are nationalists of a new kind. Now, this is a big debate in our scholarship, so I have to address that. It's always debated whether or not the Unionists were always Turkish nationalists, or they were first Muslim nationalists, then turned into Ottoman nationalists, or they were first Ottomanists, then Muslim nationalists, then turned into Ottoman nationalists. My point is, they were nationalists, and actually after the Balkan Wars, their nationalism's emphasis on ethnicity has changed tremendously. And they are enormously radicalized after 1930. And they become the sole decision makers in the empire, especially for the years following up and including the Great War. So this is the start of the period of crisis. There's an interesting map that is relevant for our story here. This is the map of territorial modifications in the Balkans during the Conference of London and then the Treaty of Bucharest, which are basically two treaties that are related to the First and the Second Balkan Wars. The bottom line is, remember that large chunk of territory that you saw at the beginning of the presentation in the Balkans? All of that is lost. And what happens to Muslim Ottoman inhabitants of those territories are relevant for our story. Now let's go back to the micro-story for a second. Let's go back to Foça. What was happening in Foça? During the Balkan Wars, literally nothing is happening in Foça. There are no cases of war. What really happens is trade. International trade is halted. Naturally so. There's a war, there's a naval battle happening in the Aegean. All ports are blocked, so international trade ceases. But war never really jumps to Western Anatolia. The main theaters of war are in the northern Aegean in terms of the sea battles and in the Balkans naturally. So there's nothing happening during the war. But immediately after the war, there's a major change happening. Between the dates 11th and 18th of June 1914, consequently and continuously for 7 days, Muslim bandits start to encircle the county of Foçateyn. These Muslim bandits, also described as members of Çetes, started to circle the county from its outer rims. They target major locations, initially small towns, and they try to move from the small villages, towards the town center Eski Foça and Yeni Foça. During these events, these bandits force the native Ottoman
Christian population of the county of Foçateyn to migrate. And if there is resistance, and there were cases of resistance, they use violence and they kill the resistors. What happens is, at the end of those 7 days of what I would call organized chaos, and I'm going to explain you why I call it like that, there is literally no Ottoman Christian left in the Ottoman county of Foçateyn. And soon enough, not before the events, not during the events, a couple of days after the events in the case of the county's small villages, a week later in the case of the county's central towns, Muslim refugees, who are themselves displaced much like the Ottoman Orthodox Christians of Foçateyn, are settled in the houses of the Ottoman Greeks. The entirety of the non-Muslim population disappears after the events. The culprits, some of them were caught, some of them were giving photographs to the photographers, were never punished. And in my humble opinion, and I will explain you why, I think the Unionist government at the time was culpable. Actually, this wasn't a story only about Eski Foça. Actually, during and after the period where these events happened, at about 160,000 Ottoman Greeks are forced to migrate. This number was much debated until recently, but there's a book that was published by, that was published by Burak Mardakçı. It's actually an edited volume of a very, how should I call it, famous or infamous book of Talat Pasha, the Black Book, in which he actually talks about the total number of deportees and massacred individuals in the Ottoman Empire in the process that Unionist reign continued after the coup. And this number is from there, and I also have a couple of other sources that I can freely share with you in the Q&A part. All in all, this was a regional phenomenon, starting roughly at the bottom of Çanakkale and going all the way to Muğla. Most of the western Anatolian seaboard was cleansed of its Ottoman Christian population. And in some cases, Foça is a case like that, both Palya and Neafoki are cases like that, Urla, if I'm not mistaken, and Edremit are cases like that. Muhajirs are settled into the houses of the Greeks that were forced to deport. Now, this photograph has its own story. I don't have much time to talk about it right now, but we can again address it in the Q&A. This demographic engineering chapter of Unionists is very unique, because most of the time we have circumstantial evidence, missing pieces of the puzzle, when it comes to discuss the demographic policies of the Young Turks, the Unionists, between 1913 and 1918. But this case is unique because there happened to be an architect, a French architect, Félix Sarthe, who was commissioned by the French state to undertake excavations in Palyafokia, because Foça, way back in the ancient Greek times, was a main Greek settlement. And actually his right for excavations was provided by the Ottoman government, and he happened to be there when the demographic policy was taking place, when the Oosting operation actually was taking place. So he took many pictures, and this is just one of them. And in this picture, what you see is, on the right-hand side, there's a flag, that's a French flag, and that is the house that he rented, actually. In front of that house, there's a group of Ottoman Christians, Ottoman Orthodox Christians, Greeks, shaking their hands towards a large ship, which you'll see in a second towards the end of the presentation, to a ship for refuge, because they are trying to run away. The members of the Çete that you see here are proudly presenting their pillage to the photographer, an umbrella, a couple of private luxury stuff from the houses that they just looted. And in the extended version of the photograph, you can see fires coming from the mixed quarter of the town, which used to have the main shops, which suggests us, also based on written account, that the shops were also picketed and looted. So this is an interesting case because when you look at the Ottoman correspondence, Minister of Internal Affairs Talat Pasha's correspondence with Istanbul, or how he talks about the events to external press, what he talks about is basically saying that Muhajirs, Muslim refugees from the Balkans, who had resentment, were joined by the local Muslims of Foça, and they attacked to native Christians out of resentment. Anybody else but him, including the photographs, although suggests something else. Nobody knew about the Çetes. both oral historical accounts and other correspondence showed us these people were considered foreigners to the county, so they weren't local Muslims joining in a group. And it is very highly likely that they had some muhajirs among them, but they weren't muhajirs that were coming from the Balkans seeking refuge, because they were, as we all know from the Ottoman archives, were waiting in Izmir's port to be settled. And the government was very strict about it, because it knew that if it unleashed refugees immediately to find whatever houses they can find and grab, that would create chaos. And they also were putting them under quarantine for health reasons, as you can imagine. So muhajirs will only come after the real ousting happens, not before. This is a demographic statistic that concludes the story about demography and puts it all together in a nutshell, basically. And these are all Ottoman censuses. Scarpettis is not included in this one. It starts in 1880, goes until 1917. And if you look at Islam, Ottoman Muslims obviously, the number always fluctuates around 3,600s. It always fluctuates around that. And bam, in 1914 it doubles, and then it goes slightly more than 1,000 more in 1917. Now there's a big puzzle that I wasn't able to solve up until this day. I can only speculate about that. When exactly was the population census of 1914 was done? And interestingly, what I have been able to find so far suggests that it was done before the ousting. So in other words, muhajirs were counted before they arrived. And there might be good reasons for that, which I discuss in length in my book, because I didn't have a chance to talk about this, but Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Greece was actually entertaining an idea of a population exchange after the Balkan Wars, which wasn't realized after the Balkan Wars, but as you all know, it was realized in the form of the Treaty of Lausanne after the hostilities ended in 1922. So it's likely that there might already have been a plan to settle them, but we know that for a complex set of political reasons, which I again discussed, it doesn't work out. Maybe the unionists said, sure, maybe there's no agreement, but we'll still impose it de facto. What you see here is the number of Ottoman Greeks, almost geometrically increasing throughout the second half of the 19th century, from 7,000 all the way onto a record high of 15,670 in the year 1914. Again, interestingly, they are counted in that census, but in the next census, there are 0 Ottoman Greeks left in the county of Foçateyn. So, why did that happen? Begs the question. Why did that happen? Because when I started this research, I promised to myself I'm always going to ask this question, because to me it looks counterintuitive. Because most of the states rely on taxation and production. And states need a lot of cash, especially reforming states. So let's give a benefit of the doubt to any and all forms of state, whether we like them or not. States do not really want to get rid of human capital very easily. There must be very convincing reasons. And when I say convincing, I'm using in quotation marks. Convincing for one person and another person can mean entirely different things, because there's something called ideology. There's something called the way we look at the world. So the question then is, how did the rulers of the Ottoman Empire, which at that point meant the Committee of Union and Progress, perceive the world around them, perceive their own empire and the role of Orthodox Christians in it? Maybe that might help us. To me, this is not a story of inevitable demise, but a story of imposed change and interrupted transition. I don't see a story in which intercommunal tension was building up to the spring of 1914. On the other hand, I see an imposed change. First of all, we have to understand something. The coup of 1913, Baba Ali coup, and the empowerment of the radicalized, sorry, this sentence is wrong. The coup of 1913 empowered the radicalized leadership of the CUP. What do I mean by that? Before 1913, if you look at studies on late Ottoman Empire, you would often encounter arguments like unionists always struggled to come to power, but they had ups and downs, and they almost were erased by power play with a counter coup coming from the Halasker Zabitan immediately before the Balkan Wars. So this was their attempt to seize power, and then they succeeded. But there's also a change in the way they perceive the world. And this has to do with their personal histories, really. Think about the unionist leadership. Think about its most famous leaders. Think about, for instance, the founder of the Republic of Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, born in Thessaloniki. Think about the three most important pashas of the post-coup era: Talat Pasha, Cemal Pasha, oh my God, Enver Pasha. Sorry, I'm getting tired. Enver Pasha, coming from a Gagavuz Turkish background, his family background goes into a refugee family history. When you think about, for instance, Talat Pasha, born in Kırcaali, which later will become Bulgaria. When you think about Cemal Pasha, he was born in Lesbos, Mytilene of Mytilene, Midilli. He has a Muhajir background. But what does it tell us? If you ask the question for a larger group of unionists who were provincial representatives of the party or had important roles of the party, a very interesting picture emerges. Predominantly, they came from refugee families. And most of them became refugees during the Balkan Wars. And they had all the reasons to have resentment, and they had the resentment, and they wrote about it actually. One of the most infamous unionists, who also had very important roles in the deportation and massacres of Ottoman Armenians in 1915, for instance, Mehmet Reşit Şahingiray, Dr. Reşit Şahingiray, also came from a refugee background. And in his very dark memoir, if I might say, he openly talks about why he feels resentment against Ottoman Christians, why he describes them as tumors that should be replaced from the nation's body and stuff like that. So in other words, radicalization of the unionists plays a role here. The other thing that plays a role in this event is the Muslim refugee crisis of the Balkan Wars. In my book, I talked about this in length. There is a parliamentarian discussion between Talat Pasha, then Minister of Interior Affairs, and Emanuelidis, the MP from the province of Aydın, and he's talking about the Emanuelidis Effendi has heard about these deportations, and he's asking the Minister of Internal Affairs what's happening, why is this happening, and Talat Pasha tries to make an explanation. He kind of makes up a story, and at one point he says, well, to resettle refugees we need a lot of money, and we can't send them to the deserts in Syria, because if we send them they'll perish there. Well, you know who he sends there a couple of years later. So since we don't have the money, we had to find another measure. So this was a suitable measure. Now this is important because Ottomans were really left with a refugee crisis. The world wasn't like this in the past. And when some 500,000 refugees were displaced from the Balkans, they found themselves in the major port cities and port towns of the Ottoman Empire, or what is left of it. And the Ottomans really were struggling to solve this, but it doesn't necessarily mean displacing other people. You need to have the ideological conviction to do that. There's another reason: unsustainable peace treaties of the Balkan Wars. That's something that is usually overlooked in the literature. So the First Balkan War happens, Treaty of London. Second Balkan War happens, Treaty of Bucharest. And then we enter into a very interesting arms race period between the Kingdom of Greece and the Ottoman Empire. Throughout the peace negotiations, it was perceived that the then Ottoman islands like Chios or Mytilene, Sakız and Midilli were to be left to the Ottomans, or they were to be declared independent entities. What ended up, again it's a confusing and complex story, Venizelos is able to convince the great powers of the time to give these islands to Greece. And as he does that, he actually strategically puts the Kingdom of Greece and the Ottoman Empire on a road to collusion. Why? When you read the diplomatic correspondence of the time, it becomes obvious. Both states, immediately after the peace treaties in 1913 and 14, fear another war is imminent. Because places like Midilli are basically so close to places like Ayvalık, any one of the states can stage an amphibian or naval blockade very quickly if they decide to go into war, and whoever does that has the upper hand. So it is a scenario, it is a border which is actually not a sustainable border. And if you want proof of that, look at what happened in the recent refugee crisis. That really is a hard border to protect. And that border conflict made the decision makers on both sides think that a war is imminent. What do you do when you think the war is imminent? You go into arms, and that's precisely what happened. There was a naval arms race, and actually the Kingdom of Greece had the upper hand and the incentive to start a war before the Ottomans get their soon-to-be named Yavuz and Midilli. So, an interesting period is happening between the Balkan Wars and the Great War. Two states want war, but they also don't really want war at the same time. And when you look at the Unionists, they openly say, look, if there's going to be a war, we might lose it like we've lost the Balkan Wars. And they think, again I discussed this in the book, for right or wrong reasons, they think one of the reasons why they were defeated was the conscription of Christians in the army. As you know, Unionists are the ones to pass the law of universal conscription in the Ottoman Empire for the first time after 1909, and actually Balkan Wars is the first major challenge where Christians are fighting together with Muslims as a part of the Ottoman army. So for many Unionists, they were quote-unquote backstabbed. And they think that can happen again if there were to be a war, so they want to get quote-unquote rid of internal enemies. And because they are radical nationalists at that point in time, when they look at the Ottoman Christian communities, they do not make any distinctions between any level of peacefulness or allegiance to the national cause or not. They indistinctively describe them as problems or internal enemies or fifth column, something which unfortunately still happens in this country. Another reason I would argue are the territorial ambitions of the Kingdom of Greece, because Kingdom of Greece was a very irredentist state by its very nature. Oh, all right. It was a very proactively irredentist state, especially during the dawn and the continuation of the Great War. It's also one of the reasons. Imminence of a Greco-Turkish war, I already explained, was one of the reasons. This is another the photograph from the days of the All-Sing in 1914 in Eski Foça. What you see here is not the first day, one of the consecutive days. My guess is the second or the third day. The flocks of people are still coming from the small villages to the main town because they think they have higher chance of finding ships in Eski or Yeni Foça, and they do find ships only to be carried to the small islets first and then to Mytilene, which then became a Greek island at that point in time. The aftermath. Does the story end here? Unfortunately not. The Great War starts in 1914. The Ottoman Empire joins the war on the side of Central Powers. The war witnessed the demographic remaking of Anatolia by the Unionists. This further increases antagonisms, especially between non-Muslims and non-Muslims of the empire. The Great War does not really end for the Ottomans in 1918, as you all know. It kind of ends in 1922 with the Treaty of Lausanne, which is official. It becomes official in 1923. And followed by the Greco-Turkish population exchange. In all of those chapters, Foçateyn is affected again and again and again. Let me give you a concrete example. 1914, the Greeks are ousted. There are 0 Greeks, right? The war is lost by the Ottomans. There's an interregnum. Paris Peace Conference is happening. Great powers cannot decide what to do with the Ottoman Empire. Greece jumps in, by the way, with an operation which was legally and diplomatically framed as, and I quote, a diplomatic peacekeeping operation, and turns it into an occupation that can be remembered by looking at the map. And during that occupation, the Greek administration that administers Aydın province and Izmir and Foça decides to resettle the displaced Greeks. But there's a big question. Those houses are full. What is going to happen to Muhajirs? Muhajirs are forced out one more time from those houses, and some of them run towards Anatolia. My guess, because I have some accounts, some parts of the puzzle, some of them join to the national resistance, but most don't even make it as far as Afyon or Ankara. They just end up in the northwestern parts of the Aegean. But then the Greek adventure in Anatolia, so to speak, ends with a disaster, and the Greek army is defeated and they start to retreat. And then what happens to Foça? Foça is liberated, and during the process of liberation, those who were repatriated are displaced again, this time much more violently, and only a very small portion of them make it alive to the port of Izmir. Muhajirs, most of them die during the war because of diseases or the war itself, and only a small portion of them can make it back to Foça. And during this whole period, in 1914, repatriation, redisplacement, liberation again, Foça's physical structure is destroyed over and over and over again. For instance, if you're not interested in the history of World War I, you might not know this, but World War I was the first battle in the world where heavier than air vehicles were used for bombardments, and people were dropping bombs with their hands most of the time, or with very, very primitive machines, which meant they usually did not hit the target. Now, Foça had 2 castles. These castles had artilleries, and it was bombarded by at least once by the French and once by the British, and most of the medieval center of the town to this day is destroyed because of that bombing. In other words, not only demographic destruction, but physical destruction also follows. These are the subsequent chapters: the ousting, the Allied bombings, ousting and repatriation again, Treaty of Lausanne, and this is the end of the story. Nation states and homogeneous populations become the norm in the region, and the cosmopolitan spaces of Western Anatolia disappear. These 2 photographs are very telling in that. They are taken from more or less the exact same place on top of a hill that sees Foça from a distance. The first one was taken in 1913, a busy port, a lot of new houses. By the way, on a year on average, more than 2,000 ships entered and exited Eski Foça's Bay. As you can see some of them over there. The other one, my guesstimate, is 1926, so I'm saying mid-1920s, with some reservation. Same location. Look at the center of the medieval town, it's almost entirely destroyed, the depots are destroyed, most of the houses are gone, in all neighborhoods, irrespective of who the majority population there was. And this, I think, is not a microhistory of Foça only. This might be a regional story. When you look at the studies on Ayvalık or Urla or Kuşadası or Izmir, especially covering the same time frame that my study covers, you see a similar rhythm of transformation, and then a period of crisis, and then a transformation from an imperial structure to a nation-state structure. Thank you for listening. I think I've run out of my time.
Let's arrange the setting
Yeah,
for
Oktay
the comment and the Q&A. I will bring you to that will ask you to speak.
Okay. Ben alayım. Tamam. Nasıl geçmek istersin?
Öyle mi? Tamam.
Son. Okay. Thank you, Emre, and thank you for coming as well. I've listened to Emre before. We were both in Leiden when his book came out, when my book came out, and Eric's book came out, and when we came together to celebrate and congratulate each other, we talked about the books then, and then I read some chapters, the most juicy and relevant chapters of his work then, and I read the remaining ones recently during just past 2 or 3 days. Now, on the basis of what I see in his work, not necessarily through his presentation today, I would like to talk about some other dimensions of his work. His study, and as an outcome of his study, based on years' research, the book. Actually, his work is, as he just presented it at the beginning, is a good example of micro-historical research, microhistory, as we usually say or call. But it was not only a microhistory. Yes, microhistory also includes macro analysis in it. I rather prefer to call it a kind of global history as well. Huh?
Exactly.
Okay, global and local together.
Back and forth.
I don't know whether we use it in historical research, but it fits well. So this is really a good example of such an approach in historical research. And in that respect, it communicates well with the recent scholarship in the field. And Ottoman history and historiography is also developing in that direction. Macro and micro level analysis, multidimensional developments, they were all counted in, and then you eventually develop a kind of combined, a more sophisticated, nuanced text analysis of certain periods or certain events. So this is really a good example of that. And it also is a good case study, which tells us a lot about long 19th century. The main characteristics, developments of the 19th century. I mean, with the economic developments, it goes back to the beginning, even of the 19th century or even late 18th century. In terms of the specific context of the escalating violence, intercommunal conflicts, tensions, etc., it tells us a lot about the late 19th century context. And in terms of its links with the migrations of, again, the later part of the 19th century, it also includes those migrations, both as a result and also as a cause of new problems. So yesterday I was in my Ottoman history course, I had an introduction to 19th century, and I just portrayed a very large picture of 19th century, touching upon many of these elements, and eventually I found myself saying that, okay, the Ottoman Empire at the end of the 19th century was a suffocating empire. An empire suffocating. And then I felt suffocated as well while talking about these things. So it was really such a tragic, dramatic chapter, episode of Ottoman history. But it is not limited to Ottoman history. You may see similar developments elsewhere. It was equally painful with local actors and also groups of peoples within the Ottoman Empire. I found especially useful the Emre's framework that Emre also referred to. This separation of different regions into two categories: coast, interior, and frontiers. It's really a useful, thought-provoking approach. So Emre's book and study is a good employment of that approach to the matter. And when I read it, in his book I wanted to see, I remember these things from elsewhere, and then yes, Black Sea coastal towns had certain characteristics similar to what you are talking about. Foça, in the context of Foça or Foçateyn, Samsun, for example, as a rising coastal town.
Mersin can be a similar
you
example.
mention all these Eastern Mediterranean towns, but I felt that so probably Black Sea towns could be also analyzed in the same manner. That's about certain characteristics of Emre's work. Yes, it was also a multifaceted analysis, more nuanced reading of that particular episode based on a different kind of research. Methodologically speaking, it is novel and original, and there are employment of different types of sources, which includes oral history works that he himself carried out, plus he used some records of the interviews of the Greeks who were forced to leave Anatolia and ended up in Greece. So now their records, interviews are housed in Asia Minor,
Central Asia Minor states. Also interviews done with local Muslims who lived in the late 19th century.
Yeah. I didn't know that there were handwritten records of those interviews. Actually, you say that some of the records are only handwritten, not orally recorded.
It's the other way around. The Greek ones are mostly handwritten, but the ones about Ottoman Muslims are in cassettes.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay,
Which makes it very hard.
Turkish, perhaps. They were. Some of them were speaking Turkish, I think.
You mean
that's
Greeks?
what I remember. The Greeks.
Exactly. Or Karamanlidika.
Yeah, there is a big collection, and it's a very valuable source that I knew of, but this is the first a case study where it is successfully employed. So I really would like to congratulate Emre for his methodologically new and novel study as well. To me, his work is, okay, it's about Macedonian question transferred to Western Anatolia, as he puts it in his book. And I think that fits well into the context. I agree. Macedonian question was transferred into the Anatolia, first Western Anatolia. Then probably certain methods or the influences of the same Macedonian question went further to Eastern Anatolia. There was another question which has its own name, Armenian question. Two big questions, international issues that the Ottoman governments had to deal with during the second half of the 19th century. So these two big questions just met in the Eastern Anatolia a couple of years later during the Tehcir in 1915-16. So I see in this story, in Emre's story, certain elements which we will later on see in the case of what happened in Eastern Anatolia during the Tehcir, which escalated into, not escalated, actually it was planned, now I can easily say that, into violence and massacres. So, and there is, in his book, there is some references and implications towards the agency, actually. The agents that we see here and we see there later on in 1915. We see the same figures there. And it seems that this was one of their earlier experiences of such. And later on, they used such an experience in Eastern Anatolia as well. So Macedonian question practically visited Western Anatolia, but its impacts, influences, and psychology also contributed greatly to what would happen later on in 1915 in Eastern Anatolia as well. So these are historically linked issues. As historians now, we are trying to understand better what kind of links we could establish. We don't need to, of course, but the reading of the material just make us think of such links, so we can't avoid them. The other novelty of Emre's work is about the methodology, not sources that he uses only, but his discussion of certain frameworks, approaches to late 19th century Ottoman history developments, but also to such complicated cases. How should we approach? How can we explain the course of events? So all type of classical causality is not enough. Okay, this happened, then that happened, so it eventually caused this, what happened next. So there is a kind of, in that old approach, shortcoming that doesn't explain everything, and then which has a tendency to reduce complex events into just simple single factor causality, causal relationships. So here in his work he refers to path dependency approach, attitude, and then his discussion of that approach is, I think, significant, and it also represents the recent trends in historiography. In the Armenian case, for example, in 1915 Armenian genocide issue, we have again good examples of different approaches and their shortcomings, and eventually they also started to employ similar approach, and that he refers to as path dependency, and many of you also know what it is. In the 1915 case, in the Armenian genocide case, Dadrian portrays a kind of historical longue durée and describes it as a kind of genocidal process, a kind of essentialist attitude that, okay, the course of events would eventually go to that end. So it was inevitable. So it is criticized, and we don't see it that way anymore. Later on, Donald Bloxham developed another approach which just says, okay, emphasize the accumulative radicalization. That radicalization includes CUP is your radicalization.
I refer to the way he looks at it, actually.
So we are talking about the same thing here. But that's not also what he does.
There's also realpolitik.
Yeah, because it accumulates. So again, it's also inevitable that it would go to that end. So Yektan Türk Yılmaz's approach on that issue has many similarities with Emre's work, because Yektan's work also develops a similar attitude and also opens some rooms for alternatives, which still existed at the very last minute. So the last-minute decision-making processes, the last-minute decisions by the power-holding groups actually changes everything overnight, okay? In his case, he didn't see any serious signs of intercommunal tensions and conflicts, which one would think that would develop into that end, but suddenly, then the CUP, big brothers, big guys, heavy abiler, ne diyoruz biz onlara? Ağır abiler comes in and does something, then nothing is the same as before. Things change fundamentally, and then we see development of events in a different direction. So you can't explain this by reference to what had happened earlier necessarily. So path dependency here refines our approach to such matters, and then Emre's work is really a good example of that. I really congratulate him in that too. Okay, these are about his work, and then I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Perhaps we may also present it to the audience here. One is about nation state, and then that was a kind of discussion that you also involved, I think, in different meetings. And then you also refer to the nationalist stance of the CUP leadership. Ottomanism, Islamism, Turkism, no, whatever you say, okay, they were nationalists, you say. Yes, at this time, it is clear that they were nationalists, or they chose some nationalist stance and followed policies in that line, along that line. And then in your work, you say that this is also a transition from, okay, an empire into a nation state. Yes. And you also refer to the general atmosphere of the time, a kind of zeitgeist of developments towards nation state. But what is not clear in your presentation and in your book as well, that whether we should really take the CUP leadership as individuals who had a clear nation-state project in 1914, or they just were the leadership, the cadre of the CUP, who went along that general tendency towards nation-state. So that's a may sound a bit technical question, but not technical. So this is something to do also with reading history backwards. So you know what happened later on, nation states. So what we see here is necessarily a step towards nation state. So this is a discussion that emerged in some of the meetings that we both attended in the past, and then I would like to know what you think about it now, and then what that discussion produced. I mean, has it continued or just stopped there in those meetings? And I would like to know more about that. Okay, that's okay, questions are here.
Shall I try to address this, or?
Okay, no, it's, I think, yeah, these are the questions. That is the question. So my other last remarks, if I may, just, okay, what I felt when I was reading Emre's book and also articles that he published in some of the volumes where I also published articles in Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa and things like that. Actually, there is a follow-up reading of your story, which came out before your book, Ryan Gingeras's Sorrowful Shores. Huh?
Yes.
Yeah. And then when I read yours, and then I said, oh, okay, I should reread Ryan's book, because actually it might be very useful to read it after yours now, to link the two stories, and then also to see how Ryan takes up some other elements of your story and then further it into the national independence war. Again, the site is the same site, the region is the same region.
The network is the same network.
Yeah, and the network is the same network. That's something that I would really recommend the audience as well. I mean, read the two books together. And also the literature, literary works, it reminded me of. And I'll stop here. Louis de Bernier's
Birds Without Wings.
Birds Without Wings is one book, and Yaşar Kemal's Quartet, the last four. Bir Ada Hikayesi, an island story. Actually, I was reading Yaşar Kemal's books when you were just working on your manuscript for the publication. These two literary works are also essential, reading for historians as well. Okay, we tell a serious story, but they do tell a serious story as well, in their own way. So, as a historian, I was trained in that traditional way as a serious historian, but recently I try to feel more closer to literature. And I think the works, a decent professional historical research such as Ryan's, Emre's, should be read together with such literary works, novels as well, to get a better grasp of the spirit of the time, and then also it enriches us. That's what your work just reminded me of once more last night. Thank you, and thank you.
Thank you. Can you open this?
So first of all, let's log out of this. Let's log in.
There are some nice pictures that I might.
Yes, but I need to do acrobatics to do my password. Yes. So what I would suggest is that 3 minutes to respond to those questions.
Okay.
And then we'll have 20 minutes for Q&A.
Okay. If you're asking me if the Unionists had a clear nationalist project in their mind in the year 1914,
Nation-state project.
exactly, how to create a nation-state, clear project, my answer would be no. They have a haphazard patchwork-like big ideas, but they had questions of priority. They thought some things were very urgent to deal with. And I think their personal experiences, and many people's studies deal with that. Erik Jan's study deals with that. Another colleague of us, Fuat Dündar's study deals with that. Other people's study deals with that. Their immediate experience in the Balkans informs them about what is important first. And I think demography is one reason. Capitulations are another thing, for instance. Universal conscription is something in their head. There are these things. And when you look at them from the point of view of, let's say, political science, theories of nationalism, these things that they are obsessed about or they think they are important are all things that we take prerequisites of a nation state. So, they are important things, homogenization of demography and so on and so forth. But my answer would be, they didn't have a clear thing. It was happening in the moment. They had some priorities. The other thing that you were referring to, there's this debate in the scholarship, when exactly did the nation state start? 1914, 1920, Tanzimat, choose your pick. There's a heated debate about this. 3 minutes is not enough. And my position was, and still is, I'm trying to build up on it, is that nation state and empire are ideological constructs in our head. They don't really exist in real life, so we choose to define them in certain ways. There's this general definition of what a nation state is. For instance, empires have hierarchies between people, embedded, codified, written hierarchies or customs that create hierarchies, whereas nation states, at least in idea, treat everybody equally. When you look at this, you can make a point that it was Tanzimat, So my point in the big debate is I don't think it's as late as 1914. The process of transformation started earlier, during the reform period, depending on what part of the definition we emphasize. That's my position. So I can't say the year 1914 after the Balkan Wars is the start of a nation state. No.
I don't want to find such exact dates.
Yeah. So those are my quick answers. And Ryan Ginger's book, I use it in my own study. A wonderful book. Looks at Marmara region mostly. A fascinating study. Does a very similar thing to what I was well informed by his study when I started my own research and was influenced by it.
Great. So a compact Q&A of 20 minutes, which can continue with wine. I would ask you to reveal your name, because we're having a recording which will be public after that, and don't get intimidated if I get a photo of you while you're holding your question.
And your TC kimlikli and everything. With the question, please.
Hands up. First 3 questions. 1, 2, first 2. Sure.
Okay. My name is Berkesen from Bilkent University International Relations Department. Well, Emre, first of all, thank you so much for this very illuminating lecture and obviously a fascinating project that you have. I have actually 2 questions that involve both the time period before these events took place and also the time period that would come immediately afterwards. You already began to discuss this towards the end of your lecture, and even though they don't really pertain directly to what you just talked about, I think the implications do involve them. So feel free to ignore parts of my question, or if you think that they are related, address them. So my first question is, what happened to these çetes that emerged in 1914? Did they create the making of the Kuvayi Milliye that would emerge in 1919, 1920? Did they just disappear? I mean, who are these people and what would become of them in the coming years, immediately after the period that you talked about? My other question is about what happened in the Balkans, which you briefly touched upon from 1876 and onwards. Now, the word çete is, if I remember correctly, is a Serbian origin, right? So these kind of...
Let's call it Balkan origin, not to start a fight.
Okay. So, fair enough. Right, the population exchange that took place in 1923 give this suggestion of reciprocity. Mm-hmm. And I completely agree with this notion of organized chaos that took place in 1914. So then the question is, was this also was there an element of reciprocity involved? So in other words, the çetes, the Ottoman actions, is this really a very Ottoman Turkish or Ottoman Muslim invention? Or have we actually seen similar events in different parts of Balkans that ended up targeting the Ottoman Muslim population in the preceding decade. So how much of it is really modular, sort of unique to the Turkish context or this local context? How much of it is really learned experience being in a very vicious fashion exerted onto the local Greek population?
Okay, thank you.
Should we take the second question and then?
No.
No.
Because I forget things.
Okay.
My short-term memory is not that good. So, what happened to Cetes? If I know the answer to this question, I would have the best book written. But we have very nice pieces of the puzzle. These particular people, what happens to them? Talat Pasha says he's going to punish them. He never does. We know that for a fact. We know in 1915 some people who were arrested for Çete activity in Western, Eastern and Central Anatolia were released from prison to be used during some deportations, for instance. But are they the same people? I don't think so. But there's an even more telling thing. Who organized this is a big question. And what we have is circumstantial evidence. And we don't have any Ottoman internal affairs telegram, coded telegram saying these guys should do it. But for instance, we have things like Mehmet Reşit Şahingiray's memoirs, in which he talks about how people like Kuşçubaşı Eşref, together with Şahingiray, goes to Istanbul at a meeting in Talat's house. They decide to act upon the question of Western Anatolia and avoided it from becoming, and here I quote, another Macedonia. So in order to avoid it becoming another Macedonia, they go into fact-finding missions. Kuşçubaşı does that, Mehmet Reşit Şahingiray does that. They come back, they write to Talat, they say we have to take action, and we know that Kuşçubaşı did take action. So he was, for instance, responsible for the Greek boycott, which is simultaneously happening, by the way, at the same time, and the shop picketings with the help of Cetes. How do we know it? We have a wonderful PhD study. Doğan Çetinkaya's work actually talks about that. So at least he was a reis of the Cetes, and you know what happens to Eşref Kuşçubaşı, needless to say. We also have another thing, which is quite contentious to discuss in Ankara, actually. So unionists want to act upon Western Anatolia's situation because they think there's a dire potential of being backstabbed. But they don't trust the guy who is ruling the province, which is Rahmi Bey. Comes from, Evrenovskiller. He's a martyr himself. He has a very quote-unquote cosmopolitan outlook, according to Mehmet Reşit Şahingiray. He's not well trusted in the unionist circles. So somebody else is needed, not through official appointment, but through party appointment to... Exactly. And that person is Celal Bayar. And if you then trace what happens to him, you find your answer, because he plays important roles in the War of Resistance and so on and so forth. The other question, reciprocity. I don't know if you're using the keyword consciously, but that's the keyword I use throughout the book a lot. Mukabele bi misil was a keyword that unionists used a lot, Talat Pasha used a lot. It doesn't really mean reciprocity, it means responding back with the times of it, But what he meant was exactly. What he meant was a very brutal understanding of reciprocity. And he talks about it openly. He says, we tried to have a population census with the Kingdom of Greece immediately after the Balkan Wars, like the quote-unquote successful one that we had with Bulgarians. It didn't work out, and this is my interpretation. We need to force the facts on the ground. And they do, because Treaty of Lausanne will include amendments about these Greeks that are displaced in 1914. We usually think about Lausanne Treaty as only talking about the displacement after the Greco-Turkish War, but it actually retrospectively covers all the displacements, including this one. So Unionist plan, quote-unquote, works in the end, in that sense. They try to force the facts on the ground, and they framed it as a reciprocal thing, and I frame it as nationalist feud at one point in the presentation, because this turns into you did this first, we did this first, you did this first, we did the first competition, which is essentially a nationalist competition. I don't know if this was helpful, but they were aware about the reciprocal nature of this in their head. Some even say, I have this chapter in my book in which I found this fascinating account of a Türk yurdu journey from Istanbul to Izmir to awake feelings of Turkishness among the Muslim youth, apparently they lack it, so that Izmir does not turn into another Selanik. And this is almost a direct quotation. On the way from Istanbul to Izmir, they take a ship and they had to dock in front of Mytilene, and there's this emotional scene in which they cry, how can the father of a Turkishness and Islam and Ottomanism for such a long time can end up being Greek within a couple of months or something like that. So you see that, it happened in the Balkans, it shouldn't happen again. And by the way, Unionists also say this. Unionists always thought the great powers would not respect irredentist claims of Greece because they believe still the maternist restorationist spirit is there in Europe. Like empires will still be alive. But Europe has changed a lot. And great powers changed their mind about small nation states. So Unionists think, oh, then this is the age of nation states. And we need to do the same thing. Of course, I'm just vulgarizing things to make a quick summary, but this is more or less what you see in their evolution of their thinking.
You had a question there? Yes.
Okay, thank you for the great. In Western Anatolia...
Can you say your name?
Sorry, Ayça. In Western Anatolia, the Greeks were obviously nationalized, especially during the Long War, but not as much as to put their national interests in front of their economic interests. I wonder if the Foça Greeks were any different, or did you come up with any example in which the Foça Greeks they acted on behalf of the Greek state instead of their economic interests?
That was a major question that I had in mind, because anybody else has that in mind. I tried to address this briefly. The quick answer is no. Rest his soul, Vangelis Kehriotis had a wonderful study about that, a couple of articles actually, and his dissertation was unfortunately never published, but it's very informing about that. Nationalist sentiment looks like it is more powerful among urban Greeks, and when you move towards urban centers to towns and villages, the life is regulated around the religious community, and most of the time religious appointments are fiercely contested between quote-unquote secular Greeks, educated in secular institutions, and traditional Orthodox clergy, which wants to influence the community. In the case of Foça, I have only seen one very clear sentiment of an expression of nationalism, and I wouldn't call it Hellenic nationalism, I would call it Orthodox nationalism. One of the big villas that were built by the shore, there's this old tradition, like the Muslims, Greeks, when they build houses, they sacrifice for their gods, and then they put a wish written in a piece of parchment, and they put it in the first stone that is found at the heart of the building. During the restoration in Foça, one of those parchments came out. Since I'm from the region, I had good connections and got my hands on the parchment, and it was actually an Orthodox prayer, very long prayer, at the end of which it says, God bless Abdülhamid II, but we hope he will be replaced by an Orthodox king in the future. That's the only, just in case he finds it out, God bless him, but still And I tried to get my hands on the curriculum of the clergy schools, nothing. It doesn't look like there were sports clubs or middle-class clubs that promoted nationalist ideas in Foça. There was no local newspaper. As such, it's a typical Ottoman town, because towns are yet not hit by this. We tend to think of all Greeks or all Muslims affected by nationalism, but it's actually mostly limited to literate urbanites. Still as late as 1914, basically.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Yusuf, and I'm not an academic, but I just graduated from international politics. And I don't have questions, but I have some critics. I hope you can tolerate.
Sure.
For example, I think you never mentioned the role and provocations of the European states during that time, conflicts building during that time. For example, Bulgarian gangs were instrumentalized by the Russians to rise the conflict and nationalism among the Bulgarians and uprisings, and then the Russian invasion came. So I think there were this kind of external forces, and if you read about the reports of the Ottoman inspectors during that time, they were reporting that the Greek gangs formulated, and these were formulated to prepare the region for the Greek invasion. So I think you never mentioned about the Greek gangs. Maybe there was a time difference. I'm not sure because I just searched right now, and
And Google tells you there were Greeks.
I just searched for academic sources. You can be sure, and if you can search it, you will find it. Anyway, I heard a lot about the Muslim immigrants attacked and came to Anatolia, but never heard about ethnic cleansing to find places for the Muslim immigrants. And you mentioned a huge number of ethnic cleansing to open place. I'm sorry, I just searched right now, but I cannot find that stories. So I just want to say this.
Okay.
You cannot keep silent.
Obviously, I didn't make up 160 people's displacement, and if you remember during my talk, I referred to a debate about the number. And I said, for instance, Talat Pasha's Black Book was a source of that number. It's not the only source of that number, actually. Minister of Internal Affairs, Dahliye Nezareti, has also coded correspondence talking about approximate numbers used in my book. FAO, the British Archives, has numbers used in my book. Greek social security planning had numbers because they had to find means to look after the displaced Greeks in the Kingdom of Greece, has numbers. All of them are comparatively looked at.
Did you search Justin McCarthy's Dead and
Yeah, I know. I used Justin McCarthy's work.
Okay, but
I mean, if you see my book...
It seems reverse.
No, Justin McCarthy never denies there were displaced Greeks, by the way. Have you ever read Justin McCarthy?
Yeah.
He never denies the displacement of Greeks.
The numbers are different than Muslim ethnic cleansing. Anyway, I don't want
Yeah,
to
okay. If you have any new works that I'm not aware of, I'm welcome to entertain them. Provocations during which times? Because during World War I there are clear provocations and propaganda. This is World War I we're talking about. If you're asking me, were there any provocations by the great powers in the period between the Balkan Wars and the Great War in Western Anatolia, I see no evidence for that. If you're asking me, were there any provocations during the Macedonian question, during the Balkan Wars by the great powers, I do see that. You got my point, right? If you're asking me if I see any Bulgarian Cheta activity in Western Anatolia, I do not see that. If you're asking me if I see any Bulgarian Cheta activity during the Balkan Wars, before the Balkan Wars in the Balkans, yes. And that's also one of the reasons why unionists think Cheta activity is quote-unquote a good idea. And actually they talk about it. They say this is Turks' trial with fire. We learned it the hard way. And there are wonderful studies about how, for instance, running in the mountains during an important event like Ilinden Uprising, fighting against Chetes, kind of taught the Unionists to use Cheta tactics for their own political ends. So in my work, I do not deny that. I do talk precisely about that, actually. I don't know if this helped, but yeah.
Okay, another question. I might take the opportunity. Okay, yes, please.
By the way, sorry, you remember the statistics? They are the Ottoman censuses. The statistics that I showed, this 0 is not my 0. This is an Ottoman state census. So this is not me decreasing 15,670 from that number. And this is accessible online, basically.
We have different reference sources than you. Sorry.
Okay.
Peter?
Okay, so Peter Cherry, British Institute, Ankara. Thanks very much. I really enjoyed that talk. I was going to ask something that the respondent mentioned actually, was just the literature question, really, and also just just wondering if, like, just generally as well, not just literature, but also perhaps music, etc. Like, is there a whole cultural archive that could also help you, I don't know, kind of get deeper into this kind of structures of feeling or what's going on. I wonder if that's useful at all.
I think it's useful, but it would require another PhD to really study them, because I did use oral history, I did use photography, but in my humble opinion, it requires an extra level of carefulness.
Right.
And I try to only refer to narratives and facts that overlap in different accounts. And when it comes to understanding literature, at least for my questions, it's not very helpful. But literature can be studied for a whole different purpose, you know. That is perhaps what you can do.
Yeah.
Yeah, not me.
Last question.
A very quick question. Does Kemal Yalçın has something about that Foça period?
I
Kemal Yalçın.
doesn't ring a bell.
Emanet Cheese, The Trusted Story. There was a book documentary novel was published. He produced a lot. That's why that I'm asking.
I
Maybe
must look at
he.
that. Maybe he does.
that you came across it. Okay.
We don't have much time, but this was actually one of the city's plans during its expansion. This is the large version of the picture that I promised you during the Austin that is happening. There are around like 16 or 17 different photographs from inside the houses and so on and so forth as well. This is one of those large depots, one of the last remaining ones during the Republican period. And this is the Foça Center during the very early days of the Republican period again. And that's it.
Right.
All right.
Yes. Thank you very much. We can actually continue with questions and discussions over wine. But just before that, because I would like to finish with a kind of positive turn of the story. We discussed this with Emre when he came today. It's very interesting that after all this harsh history from both sides, Foça was the place that the first town twinning project between Greece and Turkey in the 90s, before the 2000s explosion of friendship discourse, took place through a very, very difficult process for both communities, and it lasted almost 10 years because it was a kind of coming to terms with the past. So
yeah, CHP was responsible for that. For the pandemic.